some goodbyes are supposed to be forever. When 10-year-old Lily walked into Dr. Harold Baines' clinic, carrying her golden retriever Max for the last time, both the old veterinarian and the little girl believed they were saying their final farewell to a beloved family member. The diagnosis was clear: Max was dying, and the kindest thing was to let him go peacefully. But as Harold prepared the injection, Max did something extraordinary. The sick dog lifted his trembling paw and gently wrapped it around Lily's shoulders, like he was giving her one last hug. That's when Harold noticed something odd, a small twitch in Max's leg that didn't match what he'd been told about the dog's condition. Harold had been a vet for over 40 years, and his instincts told him to stop. What he discovered next would change everything for the dog, the girl, and himself. But what could cause such a dramatic misdiagnosis? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to the windows of Baines Veterinary Clinic like an old friend reluctant to say goodbye. Dr. Harold Baines moved through his familiar routine with the measured cadence of a man who had performed these same motions for 4 decades. At 67, his hands still held their steady precision, though the silver in his beard had long since overtaken the brown, and the lines around his eyes spoke of countless difficult decisions made with compassion. The clinic itself bore the warm patina of years well spent. Framed photographs of grateful families with their healed pets lined the waiting room. Walls a golden retriever named Chester who'd survived parvo, a tabby cat called Whiskers who'd beaten cancer, countless others who'd been given second chances. Under Harold's careful watch, the reception desk, polished smooth by decades of elbows and paperwork, held a small lamp that cast gentle light over appointment books filled with Harold's careful handwriting. On his desk sat a half-written letter, announcing his retirement to his patients, words that had proven harder to compose than any medical diagnosis he'd ever delivered. The letter represented everything he was struggling to leave behind: the trust of families who'd relied on his expertise for generations, the satisfaction of healing, the profound responsibility of holding life and death decisions in his weathered hands. "Morning, Doc," called Martha, his receptionist of 22 years, as she unlocked the front door. Her graying hair was pulled back in its usual neat bun, and she carried 2 steaming cups of coffee, one black for Harold, one with cream and sugar for herself. This small ritual had marked the beginning of each workday since she'd started. Fresh out of secretarial school and nervous about working with animals. "Morning, Martha," Harold replied, accepting the coffee with a grateful nod. The warmth of the cup felt reassuring against his palms. "Light schedule today?" "Just 3 appointments," she said, settling behind her desk with the efficiency of long practice. Mrs. Henderson bringing in patches for his arthritis check. Young Tommy Walsh with his bearded dragon, something about not eating and ... She paused, her voice softening with the weight of difficult news. "The Morrison family, they're bringing Max in at 3. Harold's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. He'd been dreading this appointment since scheduling it 2 weeks ago, when Tom Morrison had called with trembling voice to arrange what no pet owner ever wants to schedule. Max, a 7-year-old golden retriever who'd been coming to the clinic since he was an 8-week-old puppy, was facing his final visit. The diagnosis from the animal neurologist in the city had been definitive: progressive neurological deterioration with no hope of recovery. The kindest option, the specialist had said, was euthanasia. "How's little Lily taking it?" Harold asked, though he already knew the answer would settle like a stone in his chest. Martha's eyes moistened behind her reading glasses. "Tom Morrison called yesterday to confirm the appointment. Said Lily hasn't left Max's side in days. She's been reading to him, sharing her meals with him, sleeping on the floor next to his bed. You know how those two have been inseparable since she could walk." Harold didn't know. He'd watched their bond develop over 7 years of routine checkups, vaccinations, and the occasional mishap that brought them to the clinic. Lily had been barely 3 when the Morrison family first brought home the golden puppy, and Harold had witnessed their relationship bloom into something beautiful, a child and her dog growing up together, each teaching the other about loyalty, love, and the simple joy found in companionship. The first appointment of the day passed with the gentle rhythm Harold had grown to cherish. Mrs. Henderson, a widow in her 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, arrived precisely on time, carrying Patches in his familiar blue carrier. The elderly tabby cat, now 14 and showing his age in the careful way he moved, had been battling arthritis for 2 years. He's been having a bit more trouble with the stairs lately, Mrs. Henderson explained as Harold gently examined Patches on the table. The cat's green eyes held the wisdom that comes with age, and he submitted to the examination with dignified patience. Harold's hands moved with practiced gentleness, feeling for joint swelling and testing range of motion. His weight is good, and his heart sounds strong, he told Mrs. Henderson. I think we can adjust his medication to give him more comfort. As he prepared the new prescription, Mrs. Henderson's voice carried the vulnerability that often accompanied discussions about aging pets. He's all I have left, Dr. Baines. My Harold passed 2 years ago, and Patches has been my constant companion through it all. You've kept him comfortable for so long. Harold looked up from his prescription pad, understanding the deeper conversation taking place. We'll keep him comfortable as long as we can, Mrs. Henderson. Patches has many good days ahead of him. The relief in her smile reminded Harold why he'd chosen veterinary medicine 43 years ago, not just to heal animals, but to preserve the bonds that made life richer for their human families. Tommy Walsh arrived for the second appointment with the earnest enthusiasm that made Harold smile. The 12-year-old boy carried his bearded dragon, Einstein, in a proper terrarium, having researched proper transport methods with the thoroughness of a graduate student. Einstein hasn't been eating for 4 days, Tommy explained, his freckled face creased with worry. I've tried different vegetables, checked the temperature in his habitat, even offered him his favorite crickets. Nothing seems to interest him. Harold examined the bearded dragon with the same careful attention he gave to larger patients. Einstein was a healthy specimen, alert and responsive, but clearly experiencing some digestive issue. After a thorough examination and discussion of Tommy's care routine, Harold identified the problem: seasonal appetite changes combined with a slightly low basking temperature. Animals depend on us to understand what they need, Harold told Tommy as they discussed the solution. Sometimes they can't tell us directly, so we have to pay attention to the small signs and make educated guesses about what might help them feel better. Tommy took notes in a small notebook with the seriousness of a medical student. So Einstein isn't sick? He's just responding to the weather getting cooler? Exactly. We'll adjust his habitat temperature and modify his feeding schedule slightly. He should be back to his normal appetite within a week. As Tommy and his father left, Harold found himself standing in examination room 2, the space where he delivered countless diagnoses over the years. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The room held the lingering sense of antiseptic and animal fur comforting, smells that had become as familiar as his own cologne. He thought about the retirement letter sitting unfinished on his desk. Helen, his wife of 41 years, had been patient about his reluctance to set a firm date for leaving practice. She understood that walking away from veterinary medicine meant more than simply stopping work. It meant saying goodbye to a calling that had defined much of his adult life. The walls of the examination room were lined with certificates and diplomas. That marked his professional journey, his veterinary degree from Cornell, continuing education certificates, recognition awards from grateful community organizations. But the real measure of his career wasn't displayed on walls. It lived in the trust, families placed in his hands when their beloved pets needed care. "I'll miss this," he murmured to himself, running his hand along the smooth surface of the examination table where thousands of pets had been examined, treated, and healed over the decades. Even the difficult days. Harold's mind turned inevitably to what awaited him at 3 o'clock. In all his years of practice, euthanasia had never become routine. Each decision to end a pet's suffering required careful consideration of medical facts balanced against quality of life, family circumstances, and the pet's own dignity. He developed protocols and procedures to make the process as peaceful as possible, but he'd never found a way to make it easy on his own heart. At precisely 3 o'clock, the Morrison family arrived. Harold watched through the reception area window as Tom Morrison, a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and worry lines etched deep around them, gently lifted Max from the back seat of their SUV. The golden retriever's coat, once lustrous and full, had grown thin and patchy over recent weeks. His movements were unsteady, and his head hung low with the exhaustion that had become his constant companion. Lily walked beside them, her small hand resting protectively on Max's back. She'd grown taller since Harold last saw her 6 months ago during Max's routine checkup, but today she seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of impending loss. Her dark hair was pulled back in a careful ponytail, and she wore a yellow sundress, Max's favorite color. Harold remembered her telling him during a previous visit when she'd explained how Max always got excited when she wore yellow. Sarah Morrison, Lily's mother, followed close behind. She was a nurse at the county hospital, accustomed to difficult medical situations and trained to maintain composure during crisis. But Harold could see the strain in her carefully composed expression. This was different when it involved your own family, your own devastating loss. Martha buzzed them directly into examination room 2, sparing them the ordeal of sitting in the waiting area where other families might witness their grief. Harold took a deep breath, straightened his white coat, and knocked gently on the door before entering. "Hello, Morrison family," he said warmly, though his heart felt heavy with the knowledge of what this appointment would bring. "How's everyone holding up today?" Tom managed a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "About as well as can be expected. Doc, we appreciate you making time for us on such short notice." Harold knelt down to Max's level, noting how the dog's breathing was labored and shallow. Max's golden eyes, once bright with intelligence and mischief, were clouded with fatigue and the weight of illness. But when Harold reached out to stroke the dog's head with gentle fingers, Max's tail gave a faint wag, a ghost of his former exuberant greetings that had always announced his arrival at the clinic. "Hey there, old friend," Harold whispered, his voice carrying 4 decades of experience in comforting both animals and their families. "You've been such a good boy throughout all of this." Lily moved closer, settling on the floor beside Max with the natural grace of a child who'd spent countless hours at his side. She wrapped her arms around the dog's neck and buried her face in his fur, breathing in the familiar scent that had been her comfort through childhood fears and celebrations alike. "He knows, doesn't he, Dr. Baines?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "He knows what's happening today." Harold's throat tightened at the question that held such profound trust in his wisdom. In all his years of practice, the hardest part had never been the medical decisions. It had been moments like this, when love and loss intersected in a child's broken heart, and families looked to him for guidance through the most difficult decision they'd ever face. "Dogs are very wise about these things, Lily," he said gently, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood their lasting impact. "Max knows how much you love him, and he knows that you would never let him suffer. That's what matters most to him right now." Sarah Morrison stepped forward, her nursing background evident in the way she maintained composure while discussing difficult medical realities. The neurologist in the city was very thorough with his examination, Dr. Baines. He ran extensive tests and was certain about the diagnosis: progressive neurological deterioration with no hope of recovery. We don't want Max to suffer any longer than necessary. Harold nodded, reviewing the thick file of test results and specialist reports that had arrived by fax the previous week. The diagnosis did seem conclusive. Progressive neurological deterioration, likely genetic in origin, with no known treatment. The symptoms matched perfectly: weakness in the hindquarters, loss of coordination, difficulty swallowing, general fatigue that had worsened steadily over the past month. Every veterinary textbook he'd ever studied suggested euthanasia as the most humane choice when an animal reached this stage. "You're making the right decision for Max," he assured them, though the words felt like stones in his mouth. "Sometimes the final gift we can give our beloved pets is freedom from pain and the dignity of a peaceful passing." Tom Morrison's voice was husky with barely controlled emotion. "Max has been part of our family since before Lily could walk properly. I keep thinking about how to explain to her that sometimes love means letting go, even when every part of you wants to hold on forever." "She understands more than you might think," Harold said, watching as Lily continued to hold Max close, her small hands gentle against his fur. Children often have an intuitive wisdom about these difficult situations that adults sometimes struggle to find. As Harold moved to his medical cabinet to prepare the necessary medications, his hands fell into the familiar routine he performed hundreds of times over 4 decades. The process was always the same. First, a sedative to help the animal relax and drift into peaceful sleep. Then the final injection that would allow them to slip away, surrounded by the love that had defined their lives. Max's medical file lay open on the counter, revealing the comprehensive testing that had led to his diagnosis. Blood work, neurological examinations, advanced imaging studies, all pointing toward the same inevitable conclusion. Harold had reviewed the results multiple times, finding no reason to question the specialist's expertise or recommendations. "The first injection will be a sedative," Harold explained in his most soothing voice as he prepared the medications. "It will help Max feel very drowsy and comfortable. He'll still be aware that you're here with him, but any discomfort or anxiety will fade away completely." Lily looked up from her position beside Max, her eyes holding the kind of trust that children reserve for adults they believe can fix anything. "Will it hurt him, Dr. Baines?" "No, sweetheart. Max won't feel any pain at all. The medicine will make him feel peaceful and sleepy, like drifting off for the most comfortable nap he's ever had." Harold approached the examination table where Max lay quietly, his breathing shallow but steady. The golden retriever's condition had clearly deteriorated since his last visit 6 months ago. His muscle tone was poor, his reflexes sluggish, and his overall demeanor spoke of an animal whose body was slowly failing him, despite his gentle spirit remaining intact. "Take all the time you need to say your goodbyes," Harold said softly, stepping back to give the family privacy while remaining close enough to provide comfort when needed. "There's no rushing this moment." Lily began to whisper to Max, telling him about all their adventures together. The time he'd helped her catch fireflies in mason jars during summer evenings. The way he'd sleep at the foot of her bed during thunderstorms. How he'd learned to sit patiently while she practiced piano, even though the music sometimes made his ears twitch. Her parents joined in, sharing their own memories of Max's puppyhood. His boundless enthusiasm for car rides, his gentle way with other animals and smaller children. Harold stood quietly by the window, giving them space while remaining available to provide guidance. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and he could hear the distant sound of children playing in the park across the street. Life continuing its eternal rhythm while this small family prepared to say goodbye to a cherished member. "We're ready, Dr. Baines," Tom Morrison said quietly, his arm around his wife's shoulders as they prepared for the most difficult moment any pet owner ever faces. Harold approached with gentle reverence, carrying the preloaded syringe that would give Max peaceful sedation. The golden retriever lay quietly on the examination table, his breathing shallow but steady. Lily had positioned herself in the chair beside him, her small hand resting on his chest where she could feel each heartbeat. "This first medicine will make him very sleepy," Harold explained once more, his voice carrying the compassion he'd learned to infuse into these final moments. "Max will still know you're here with him, but he'll feel completely comfortable and relaxed." As the sedative entered Max's bloodstream through the small catheter Harold had placed, the dog's tense muscles began to relax visibly. His breathing deepened slightly, and the lines of discomfort that had marked his expression for weeks began to soften. Lily leaned forward and whispered something in his ear that made his tail twitch weakly, a final communication between companions who had shared everything. "That's perfect," Harold murmured. "He can hear you, and he knows you're here beside him." What happened next would replay in Harold's mind for weeks to come, becoming the moment that changed not just this appointment, but his entire understanding of what it meant to truly listen to his patients. As Max settled deeper into the peaceful sedation, something remarkable occurred. The dog, using what seemed like his last reserves of strength, slowly lifted his right front paw with deliberate, trembling movements, with extraordinary effort. Max reached toward Lily and gently placed his paw around her small shoulders, pulling her closer against his chest in an unmistakable gesture of comfort and love. It was as if he was trying to console her, to communicate that their bond would endure beyond this difficult moment, that his love for her transcended whatever was happening to his failing body. "Oh, Max," Lily breathed, tears streaming down her cheeks as she understood the profound gift he was offering her. "I love you too, so much." The family watched in amazed silence as Max held his position, his paw wrapped around the little girl in what could only be described as a final hug. Despite his illness, despite the sedative flowing through his system, he was using his remaining strength not to rest, but to offer comfort to the child, who had been his entire world. Harold felt his own eyes moisten as he witnessed this extraordinary display of conscious affection. In all his years of practice, he'd seen many touching farewells between pets and their families, but this demonstration of selfless love from a dying dog was something that transcended his medical experience and touched something deeper in his understanding of the bonds between animals and humans. "He's saying goodbye," Sarah Morrison whispered, her voice thick with emotion and wonder at what they were witnessing. But as Harold prepared the final injection, his trained eye caught something that made him pause. As Max held Lily close in his gentle embrace, there was a subtle movement in the dog's hind leg, not the random twitching he would expect from a heavily sedated animal with advanced neurological deterioration, but something more purposeful. A small spasm that seemed to originate from the hip area, traveling down through muscles that, according to the specialist's comprehensive reports, should have been largely unresponsive by this stage of the disease. Harold's medical instincts, honed by 4 decades of learning to read the subtle signs that animals couldn't verbalize, began sending up quiet alarm signals. The movement in Max's leg was brief, but distinct, a neurological response that suggested function in areas that should have been significantly compromised by progressive neurological deterioration. Something about this particular muscle response didn't align with what the specialist had documented about Max's condition. Harold had spent his entire career learning to notice details that others might miss, and this detail was demanding his attention in a way that made him hesitate with the syringe still in his hand. "Dr. Baines?" Tom Morrison asked, noticing Harold's sudden stillness. "Is something wrong?" Harold's mind was racing through differential diagnoses and alternative explanations for what he was observing. The movement in Max's leg, combined with his ability to perform such a deliberate and coordinated gesture as hugging Lily, SUGGESTE, neurological function, that contradicted the specialist's findings. "I need to take just a moment," Harold said, carefully, his medical training warring with the emotional weight of the situation. "Max, can you hear me, boy?" The dog's ear twitched distinctly at the sound of Harold's voice, another small but significant response that shouldn't have been possible if his neurological deterioration was as advanced as the reports indicated. Harold knelt down and gently touched Max's hind leg, applying slight pressure to specific nerve pathways with the practiced precision of a veterinarian who had learned to communicate through touch when words weren't possible. What he felt contradicted everything in the thick specialist's file lying open on his counter. There was muscle tone present, reflexive response, clear signs of neurological function that shouldn't exist in an animal with advanced neurological deterioration. "Doctor?" Sarah Morrison's voice carried a note of confusion and the first tentative whisper of hope. "What is it? What's wrong?" Harold's mind raced through the differential diagnoses he'd memorized during veterinary school 43 years ago. The weakness, the coordination problems, the general fatigue that had characterized Max's condition for the past month. These symptoms weren't exclusive to progressive neurological deterioration. They could indicate other conditions, some of them entirely treatable with proper intervention. "I need to run some tests," Harold said slowly, setting down the syringe that had been prepared to end Max's life. "There's something I want to check before we proceed any further with today's plan." The family exchanged glances that mixed confusion with the dangerous emotion of hope. They had spent 2 weeks preparing emotionally for this moment, saying their private goodbyes and steeling themselves for the heartbreak of letting Max go. "What kind of tests?" Lily asked, her voice small but urgent as she continued to hold Max close to her chest. Harold moved to his medical cabinet, searching for diagnostic equipment he hadn't used since his residency training 30 years ago. His hands found the familiar weight of an old neurological testing device, its worn metal surface polished smooth by decades of use. "There's a condition called idiopathic vestibular syndrome. It affects the inner ear and can cause symptoms very similar to what Max has been experiencing. The critical difference is that vestibular syndrome is often completely treatable." But the neurologist was so certain about his diagnosis, Tom Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 weeks spent emotionally preparing for this devastating loss. He ran comprehensive tests and seemed absolutely confident in his conclusions. "Specialists can be wrong," Harold replied, his honesty cutting through the medical authority that families often felt compelled to accept without question. "I've been wrong myself, more times than I care to admit. That's why we keep learning throughout our careers, keep questioning our assumptions, and never stop looking for alternative explanations when something doesn't feel quite right." As Harold prepared to perform the diagnostic test, he explained to the family what he was looking for with the patience of a teacher, helping students understand complex concepts. The inner ear controls balance and spatial orientation in all mammals. When it becomes inflamed or damaged, it can cause exactly the symptoms Max has been showing: weakness, poor coordination, difficulty walking, and general fatigue. Lily looked up at him with eyes that held a child's pure, unguarded hope. "Does that mean Max might not be dying after all?" Harold's heart clenched at the question, understanding the enormous responsibility that came with offering hope to a family that had already begun the process of grieving. He couldn't promise anything yet, not until he completed his examination, but he couldn't ignore what his trained observations were suggesting about Max's true condition. "It means we need to be absolutely certain about what we're dealing with before we make any irreversible decisions," Harold said carefully. "I want to perform some specific tests that will help us understand exactly what's happening with Max's neurological responses." He began the diagnostic procedure with careful precision, checking Max's eye movements in response to specific stimuli, testing reflexes that would indicate inner ear function rather than general neurological deterioration. Each response he observed strengthened his growing suspicion that the original diagnosis might have been incomplete or entirely incorrect. The specialized testing equipment felt familiar in Harold's hands despite years of disuse. During his residency, he had seen several cases of vestibular syndrome misdiagnosed as more serious conditions, but the pressure of modern veterinary practice had gradually moved him away from these older diagnostic techniques in favor of more advanced technologies and specialist referrals. The sedative is still working effectively, Harold told the family as he continued his examination. Max is comfortable and not experiencing any distress, but I'm seeing responses that suggest his neurological function may be better than the previous reports indicated. Sarah Morrison, her medical training helping her understand the implications of what Harold was discovering, asked the question they were all thinking but afraid to voice. Are you saying that Max might actually recover from this condition? Harold weighed his words carefully, not wanting to give false hope, but unable to ignore the mounting evidence that Max's condition might be fundamentally different from what they had believed. If this is vestibular syndrome rather than progressive neurological deterioration, then yes, with proper treatment, Max could potentially make a complete recovery and return to normal life. The silence in the examination room was profound and charged with possibility. Max continued to hold Lily in his gentle embrace, his breathing steady and peaceful under the influence of the sedative. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting golden light through the examination room windows and illuminating the moment when everything they thought they knew was being questioned. Tom Morrison was the first to find his voice. What do we do now? How do we know for certain which condition we're really dealing with? Harold looked at the family, then at Max, then at the syringe containing euthanasia medication that he had set aside. In 43 years of veterinary practice, he had learned to trust his instincts when they conflicted with conventional wisdom, and everything he was observing suggested that this diagnosis deserved more thorough investigation. Now we fight for him, Harold said quietly, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had dedicated his life to giving animals every possible chance at recovery. If there's even a reasonable possibility that I'm right about this alternative diagnosis, Max deserves that chance. Harold administered a different medication, an anti-inflammatory specifically designed to reduce inner ear swelling, while explaining his reasoning to the Morrison family. If Max has vestibular syndrome, we should see some improvement in his coordination and alertness within 12 to 24 hours. This medication targets the specific type of inflammation that causes vestibular problems. And if it doesn't help? Tom asked, voicing the fear that none of them wanted to acknowledge. Harold met his gaze with the honesty that had earned family's trust throughout his career. Then we'll know that the original diagnosis was likely correct, and we'll proceed as we planned today. But Max will have had one comfortable night at home with his family, and we'll have the certainty that comes from exhausting every reasonable possibility. As Harold prepared additional medications and explained the monitoring process, he made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. The weight of his professional experience was telling him to trust what he was observing, even if it meant contradicting a specialist's opinion. I think you should take Max home tonight, Harold announced, his words hanging in the air like a reprieve from an execution that had seemed inevitable just minutes before. The family stared at him in amazement. Home? Sarah repeated, as if the word represented a possibility they had never expected to hear again. Max is stable, comfortable, and there's nothing more I can accomplish here tonight, Harold explained. The anti-inflammatory medication I've given him will work regardless of where he is, and he'll be more comfortable in familiar surroundings with his family. If I'm right about vestibular syndrome, you might see signs of improvement as early as tonight. Harold helped Tom Morrison carefully lift Max from the examination table and carry him to their SUV, where they had prepared a soft bed of familiar blankets that still carried the sense of home. The golden retriever remained peacefully sedated, but increasingly responsive, his breathing steady and more relaxed than it had been in weeks. As they settled him in the vehicle, Max's tail gave a weak but definite wag at the familiar environment. "Call me immediately if anything changes," Harold instructed, handing Tom his business card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. "Anything at all, whether it seems positive or concerning. I'll have my phone with me throughout the night." After the Morrison family departed, Harold found himself alone in his clinic for the first time in years after closing hours. The silence felt different, somehow expectant rather than peaceful, charged with possibility instead of marking the end of another routine day. He settled into his office chair and opened Max's file again, this time reading the specialist's notes with a more critical eye. On his desk, the half-finished retirement letter seemed to mock his uncertainty. Here he was, 3 weeks from ending his career, second-guessing a diagnosis from one of the region's most respected animal neurologists. Was this wisdom born of experience, or was it the stubborn pride of an aging veterinarian reluctant to accept that medicine had advanced beyond his understanding? Harold reached for his old veterinary school textbook, its spine cracked from decades of use and pages yellowed with age. The margins were filled with his young handwriting earnest notes about differential diagnoses, treatment protocols, and the importance of considering all possibilities before reaching conclusions. When had he stopped consulting this foundational knowledge in favor of accepting specialist opinions without question? Martha appeared in the doorway, her coat buttoned and purse in hand, ready to leave for the evening. "You planning to spend the night here, Doc?" "Maybe," Harold admitted, looking up from the textbook that had guided him through his early years of practice. "I haven't felt this uncertain about a case in a very long time." "Uncertain or hopeful?" Martha asked with the intuitive understanding that comes from 2 decades of working closely together. Harold considered her question, while absently turning pages in his old textbook. "Both, I suppose. I keep thinking about that moment when Max reached out to hug Lily. Dogs suffering from advanced neurological deterioration typically don't have the strength or coordination for such deliberate, purposeful gestures." Martha nodded thoughtfully, settling into the chair across from his desk. "You know, in all the years I've worked here, I've watched you develop an almost supernatural ability to sense when something isn't quite right with a diagnosis. Animals can't tell us what's wrong, so you've learned to read the subtle signs that others might miss. Or maybe I'm seeing things that aren't there because I want to believe Max can be saved. When has your instinct ever led you astray when you trusted it completely?" After Martha left, Harold called Helen to explain why he would be late returning home. "I have a case that's becoming quite complicated, dear. I might have made an error in accepting another veterinarian's diagnosis without conducting my own thorough investigation." Helen Baines had been married to a veterinarian long enough to understand the code words her husband used when professional uncertainty was keeping him awake at night. Life or death complicated, or intellectually challenging complicated? "Potentially both," Harold replied, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility he felt toward Max and the Morrison family. "I might have been on the verge of ending an animal's life unnecessarily, or I might be chasing an impossible hope that will only prolong a family's suffering." "Tell me about the case," Helen said, offering the patient support she had provided through thousands of difficult decisions over 4 decades of marriage to a veterinarian. Harold described Max's condition, Lily's heartbreaking devotion, and the diagnostic uncertainty that had prompted him to halt the euthanasia procedure. Helen listened without interrupting, understanding that her husband needed to work through his thinking aloud before he could find peace with whatever decision lay ahead. "Trust your instincts, Harold," she said finally. They've served both you and your patients well throughout your entire career. My instincts initially told me that the specialist diagnosis was correct. Now, they're telling me something completely different. I'm not sure which ones to trust anymore. Maybe trust the ones that offer hope instead of the ones that foreclose. All possibilities. At home that evening, the Morrison family experienced something they hadn't dared to expect. A quiet normalcy that felt almost miraculous after weeks of watching Max decline. The golden retriever, still influenced by the sedative, but noticeably more alert than he had been in days, settled into his favorite spot on the living room rug with a contentment they hadn't seen in weeks. Lily curled up beside him with a well-worn picture book, reading aloud as she had countless times throughout their 7 years together. "Remember this story, Max?" she asked, showing him the colorful cover of a tale about a dog who saves Christmas. "You always used to get excited during the part where the dog gets to ride in Santa's sleigh." Max's ear twitched responsively at the sound of her voice, and his golden eyes tracked her movements with more awareness and focus than they had shown in recent weeks. The improvement was subtle but unmistakable to a family that had been watching his every breath with heartbroken attention. Sarah Morrison observed from the kitchen doorway, her medical training creating an internal conflict between professional skepticism and maternal hope. "He does seem more alert than he's been recently," she admitted to her husband, though her voice carried careful caution. "Maybe it's just a different medication, Dr. Baines." Harold arrived at the clinic the next morning to find Martha already stationed at her desk, a stack of fax papers clutched in her hand and an expression of barely contained excitement illuminating her face, the early morning light streaming through. The windows seemed brighter somehow, as if the very atmosphere of the clinic had been charged with possibility overnight. "Dr. Patterson called at 6 a.m., Martha announced, holding up the laboratory results that had arrived during the early hours. "The blood work results are back from the emergency lab, and you're absolutely going to want to see these findings." Harold accepted the papers with hands that trembled slightly, not from age or infirmity, but from the anticipation of confirmation for what his instincts had been telling him. As he read through the detailed laboratory analysis, his medical training allowed him to interpret the complex biochemical data, while his human heart supplied the emotional context that made the numbers meaningful. Elevated inflammatory markers consistent with acute vestibular syndrome, Harold murmured, reading the results aloud for Martha's benefit. Complete blood chemistry within normal ranges for a healthy 7-year-old dog. No indicators of systemic, neurological deterioration or degenerative disease processes. Martha's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire reception area. "That's very good news, isn't it, Doc?" "That's extraordinarily good news," Harold confirmed, feeling a genuine smile spread across his face for the first time in weeks. "Max doesn't have a terminal neurological disease. He has a treatable inflammatory condition affecting his inner ear balance centers." The phone rang almost immediately, as if the Morrison family had been maintaining a vigil beside their telephone. Throughout the night, waiting for any word about Max's condition and prognosis. "Dr. Baines? This is Tom Morrison, calling with an update that's going to sound absolutely impossible, but I need to tell you what we've witnessed." Harold settled into his desk chair, the laboratory results still in his hands serving as validation for every professional instinct he had developed over 4 decades of veterinary practice. "I'm ready to hear whatever you need to tell me, Tom." Max stood up this morning, not just lifted his head or shifted position. He actually stood up on all 4 legs and walked across the room to his food bowl. He's still unsteady and clearly requires effort, but he's moving under his own power for the first time in weeks. The laboratory confirmation in Harold's hand suddenly felt like vindication of every moment of doubt and uncertainty he had experienced the previous day. "Bring Max in this morning, Tom. I have his blood work results back from the emergency laboratory, and I believe you're going to be very pleased with what the testing has revealed." An hour later, the Morrison family walked through the clinic. Doors accompanied by a dog who, while still exhibiting weakness and coordination difficulties, bore little resemblance to the dying animal they had carried in for euthanasia just 24 hours earlier. Max's head was held high with alert curiosity, his eyes were bright and responsive, and his tail maintained a continuous wag of enthusiasm at the familiar scents and sounds of the veterinary clinic. Lily practically bounced with excitement and barely restrained joy as they entered examination room 2. "Dr. Baines, you have to see this." Max ate his entire breakfast this morning, and he even tried to play with his old tennis ball for a few minutes. Harold knelt down to conduct his examination of Max, immediately noting the dramatic improvement in muscle tone, overall alertness, and general demeanor that had occurred overnight. The transformation was remarkable and unmistakable to anyone with experience evaluating animal health and behavior. "Good morning, Max," Harold said warmly, extending his hand for the dog to sniff. "You're certainly looking much better today, aren't you, boy?" Max's response was to attempt a full-body wiggle of pure joy and excitement, nearly losing his balance in the process, but managing to remain upright through sheer determination and improving coordination. The gesture was so characteristic of his pre-illness personality that Sarah Morrison found herself laughing through tears of relief and amazement. Harold spent the next hour explaining the blood work results to the family, carefully translating complex medical terminology into language they could understand while ensuring they fully grasped the significance of the laboratory findings. Max has idiopathic vestibular syndrome, which is an inflammatory condition affecting the inner ear structures that control balance and spatial orientation. It's not terminal, it's not progressive, and in the vast majority of cases, it's completely treatable with proper medical intervention. Sarah Morrison, her medical background helping her process the technical information, asked the crucial question that would determine their path forward. What's the long-term prognosis for complete recovery? With appropriate treatment, most dogs diagnosed with vestibular syndrome make a full recovery within 2 to 4 weeks, Harold explained, his voice carrying the confidence that came from confirmed diagnosis rather than uncertain speculation. Some animals retain minor balance issues permanently, but they adapt remarkably well and continue to live normal, healthy, active lives. Tom Morrison sank heavily into the chair beside the examination table, the emotional whiplash of the past. 24 hours finally catching up with his exhausted system. "Yesterday afternoon we brought Max here to say goodbye forever, and today you're telling us he's going to recover completely and live a normal life." Harold nodded, fully understanding the magnitude of what the family was struggling to process. Emotionally, "I know it's overwhelming to reconcile such dramatically different information in such a short time period. The truth is that vestibular syndrome can be extremely difficult to diagnose accurately because it closely mimics the symptoms of much more serious neurological conditions. But you suspected it yesterday when the specialist had been so certain." "About the terminal diagnosis?" Lily asked, her child's directness cutting through medical complexity to reach the heart of the matter. Harold considered how to answer her question with complete honesty while helping her understand the nuanced nature of medical diagnosis. "I almost didn't recognize it. Lily, I was fully prepared to proceed with the specialist's recommendations until Max did something that made me pay much closer attention to details I might otherwise have overlooked." Over the following hour, Harold outlined Max's comprehensive treatment plan in detail. Continued anti-inflammatory medication to reduce inner ear swelling, specific physical therapy exercises designed to help retrain his balance and coordination systems, and regular follow-up. Appointments to monitor his progress throughout the recovery process. He also provided them with a referral to a veterinary physical therapist who specialized in treating balance disorders in animals. The recovery process won't be instantaneous, Harold cautioned, wanting to set realistic expectations for the weeks ahead. Max will need patience, support, and encouragement as he gradually regains full coordination and confidence in his movements. However, the prognosis for complete recovery is excellent based on his response to initial treatment. As Harold prepared Max's medication regimen and detailed discharge instructions, he found himself reflecting on how dangerously close they had all come to making an irreversible decision based on incomplete diagnostic information. The weight of that realization settled over him like a heavy blanket, bringing with it questions about his own professional practices and decision-making processes throughout his career. Martha noticed his contemplative mood as the Morrison family prepared to leave the clinic with their recovering dog. "You seem troubled, Doc, despite the wonderful news about Max. What's weighing on your mind?" "I keep wondering how many times over the past 43 years I've been wrong about a diagnosis without ever realizing it," Harold admitted, watching through the window as the family carefully helped Max into their vehicle. "How many cases have I handled with absolute confidence that might have had different outcomes if I had questioned my initial assumptions more thoroughly?" "You saved Max's life yesterday," Martha pointed out with the loyalty that came from 2 decades of working together. "That has to count for something significant in the grand scheme of your career." Harold continued watching as the Morrison family secured Max in his comfortable bed of blankets, the dog's tail wagging continuously despite his lingering weakness. "I almost didn't save him, Martha. I was perhaps 30 seconds away from proceeding with the euthanasia when Max reached out to embrace Lily. If that moment hadn't occurred at precisely that time, the implications hung heavy in the air between them. How many other cases had there been over the decades where Harold's accumulated experience had led him to accept diagnosis without sufficient independent verification? How many times had he allowed professional expertise to replace the fundamental curiosity that should drive medical investigation? Later that afternoon, Harold found himself doing something he hadn't attempted in years. He placed a call to Dr. Richardson, the animal neurologist who had originally diagnosed Max with progressive neurological deterioration. The conversation would be professionally delicate, requiring tact and diplomacy while addressing the significant diagnostic discrepancy. "Dr. Richardson, this is Harold Baines from the rural clinic. I'm calling about the Morrison family's golden retriever, Max, whom you examined 2 weeks ago." "Of course, I remember the case well," Dr. Richardson replied. "Sad situation with that young girl. I hope the euthanasia procedure went smoothly for the family." Harold took a deep breath before continuing. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. We discovered that Max has idiopathic vestibular syndrome rather than progressive neurological deterioration. He's responding excellently to anti-inflammatory treatment and should make a complete recovery." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Dr. Richardson responded. "I ran comprehensive neurological tests, Dr. Baines. The symptoms and test results were consistent with progressive deterioration." "Are you certain about your alternative diagnosis?" "We have confirming blood work showing elevated inflammatory markers consistent with vestibular syndrome, and Max has shown dramatic improvement in less than 24 hours of appropriate treatment," Harold replied, maintaining professional courtesy while standing firm in his findings. "This is quite unusual," Dr. Richardson admitted. "Vestibular syndrome wasn't among the differential diagnoses I considered given the presentation and duration of symptoms. I suppose it's possible that the acute phase mimicked more serious neurological conditions." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with both veterinarians discussing the diagnostic challenges presented by conditions that could masquerade as one another. Dr. Richardson proved to be gracious about the alternative diagnosis, acknowledging that medicine required humility and a willingness to learn from unexpected outcomes. "I'll certainly keep this case in mind for future reference," Dr. Richardson concluded. Thank you for taking the time to follow up. It's a good reminder that we should always remain open to alternative explanations, especially when dealing with complex neurological presentations. After ending the call, Harold sat in his office contemplating the broader implications of Max's case. Word was already beginning to spread through the local community about the miracle dog who had been saved at the last moment, and Harold's phone had been ringing throughout the day with calls from other pet owners wondering if their own animals might have been misdiagnosed. Mrs. Henderson called to ask if Patch's arthritis might actually be something more treatable. The Walsh family wondered if Einstein's appetite problems could indicate a more serious underlying condition they should investigate. Even families whose pets were healthy wanted to schedule additional consultations to ensure they weren't missing anything important. Harold realized that Max's case was raising broader questions about diagnostic certainty and the fallibility of medical expertise. People were beginning to understand that even the most experienced professionals could miss important details or accept conclusions without sufficient investigation. Martha fielded the calls with patient explanations, but Harold could see the concern in her eyes. Doc, what if this opens up questions about other cases you've handled? What if families start doubting decisions that were made appropriately, based on the best information available at the time? Harold had been wrestling with the same fears throughout the day. The success with Max was wonderful, but it also highlighted the possibility that other animals might have received inappropriate treatment due to diagnostic errors. The weight of professional responsibility felt heavier than it had in years. That evening, Harold found himself pulling out files from previous cases, searching through records of animals that had been euthanized for neurological conditions over the past several years. His hand shook slightly as he reviewed each case, looking for any signs that he might have missed alternative diagnoses or accepted specialist recommendations without sufficient independent verification. The professional liability insurance policy in his desk drawer seemed to mock him as he worked through the files. He had always maintained comprehensive coverage, but he had never seriously considered the possibility that his own diagnostic decisions might be called into question by families who had trusted his expertise implicitly. Helen found him in his home office after midnight, surrounded by case files and veterinary textbooks, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he cross-referenced symptoms and treatments. "Harold, you need to get some sleep," she said gently, placing a warm cup of tea beside his elbow. "Whatever you're researching can wait until tomorrow. I'm reviewing cases where I might have made similar errors to what almost happened with Max." Harold replied without looking up from the files. "I need to know if there are other families who trusted my judgment when I should have investigated further." Helen settled into the chair across from his desk, recognizing the signs of professional crisis that she had seen only a few times during their long marriage. "You've helped thousands of animals and families over 4 decades. One case where you questioned your initial assessment doesn't negate everything you've accomplished. But what if it's not just one case, Helen? What if there's a pattern of diagnostic shortcuts I've been taking without realizing it?" 3 days after Max's remarkable recovery, Harold arrived at his clinic to find Martha standing beside his desk with an expression of deep concern, holding an official-looking envelope that bore the unmistakable formatting of legal correspondence. The morning sun streaming through the windows suddenly felt less warm, and the familiar comfort of his office seemed to evaporate as he recognized the gravity of what awaited him. "This came by certified mail first thing this morning, Doc," Martha said quietly, extending the envelope with obvious reluctance. "It's from Hendricks, Walsh and Associates. That's the law firm that handles medical malpractice cases in the county." Harold accepted the envelope with steady hands, though his heart rate accelerated as he recognized the implications of receiving legal correspondence so soon after questioning his own diagnostic practices. The return address confirmed his worst fears about where Max's case might lead if other families began examining their own experiences with veterinary decisions. Inside the envelope, a formal legal notice announced that Harold was being sued for veterinary malpractice by the family of Bella, a 3-year-old German shepherd who had been euthanized 6 months earlier following a diagnosis of progressive neurological deterioration symptoms that now seemed remarkably similar to what Max had initially presented. The lawsuit alleged that Harold had failed to conduct adequate diagnostic testing before recommending euthanasia, that he had accepted a specialist diagnosis without independent verification, and that his negligence had resulted in the unnecessary death of a beloved family pet who might have recovered with proper treatment. The financial damages sought were substantial, but Harold knew that the professional implications could be even more devastating. Harold sank into his desk chair as the full weight of the situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. The success he had experienced with Max, which had felt like professional vindication just days earlier, was now revealing itself as the catalyst for a much larger reckoning with his career-long practices and decision-making processes. "The Hendricks family," Harold said slowly, remembering the case with painful clarity. Bella presented with identical symptoms to Max's: weakness, coordination problems, general fatigue. I reviewed the specialist findings and agreed with the recommendation for euthanasia based on what seemed like clear evidence of neurological deterioration. Martha leaned forward in her chair, her loyalty evident despite the seriousness of the situation. "You followed standard protocols, Doc. You consulted with specialists and made decisions based on the best medical information available at the time." Harold shook his head, understanding that good intentions and standard protocols might not provide adequate defense if his diagnostic approach had been fundamentally flawed. But what if I should have questioned the specialist's findings more thoroughly? What if I should have considered alternative diagnoses like vestibular syndrome before agreeing to end Bella's life? The implications extended far beyond a single malpractice lawsuit. If Harold had misdiagnosed one case, there might be others. The legal notice specifically mentioned that the plaintiff's attorneys were investigating similar cases involving other pets that had been euthanized for neurological conditions without adequate consideration of alternative diagnoses. Harold spent the morning methodically reviewing his files from the past 2 years, searching for cases that might fit the pattern now emerging. His heart sank as he identified 2 additional cases: a border collie named Sam and a mixed-breed dog called Luna that had presented with similar symptoms and received similar treatment recommendations. In each case, Harold had relied heavily on specialist evaluations and had not conducted the kind of independent diagnostic investigation that had saved Max's life. The realization that multiple families might have lost beloved pets unnecessarily created a weight of professional guilt that threatened to overwhelm his ability to function. Martha canceled Harold's afternoon appointments as he struggled to process the legal and ethical implications of what he was discovering. The clinic that had felt like a sanctuary of healing and compassion for 4 decades now seemed tainted by the possibility that his own limitations and shortcuts had caused irreparable harm to the families who had trusted him most completely. By mid-afternoon, Harold made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He placed calls to the families of Sam and Luna, asking them to come to the clinic for conversations about their pets' diagnoses and treatment. The calls were among the most difficult he had ever made, requiring him to acknowledge uncertainty about decisions that had seemed medically sound at the time. "Mrs. Peterson, this is Dr. Baines. I'm calling about Sam, and I need to discuss some concerns I have about his diagnosis and treatment. Would you be able to come to the clinic this week for a conversation?" The confusion and growing alarm in Mrs. Peterson's voice was heartbreaking. "Dr. Baines, Sam died 6 months ago. What kind of concerns could you possibly have now?" Harold forced himself to continue despite the emotional difficulty of what he was acknowledging. I've recently encountered a case with symptoms very similar to Sam's, and I'm concerned that we might not have explored all possible diagnoses before making our final treatment recommendations." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Mrs. Peterson responded with a voice that carried the weight of grief being reopened. "Are you telling me that Sam might not have needed to die? I'm telling you that I have questions about the thoroughness of our diagnostic process, and I believe you deserve to know about those concerns." Similar conversations with Luna's family proved equally devastating. Harold found himself facing the possibility that his own professional practices had contributed to unnecessary losses that could have been prevented with more thorough investigation and less reliance on specialist recommendations. The legal ramifications were serious, but the personal and professional impact was potentially catastrophic. Harold's reputation in the community, built over 4 decades of dedicated service, could be destroyed if multiple families concluded that he had failed to provide adequate care for their beloved pets. That evening, Harold sat in his home office with Helen, reviewing his professional liability insurance policy and trying to understand the scope of potential legal exposure he might face. The policy provided substantial coverage, but Harold understood that financial protection couldn't address the emotional and professional damage that would result from multiple malpractice claims. "What are you going to do?" Helen asked, recognizing that her husband was facing the most serious professional crisis of his career. Harold looked at the legal documents spread across his desk, then at the photographs of grateful families that lined his office walls. "I'm going to take responsibility for what I've done and try to make it right, regardless of the personal cost." "That could mean the end of your career, Harold. It could mean admitting to malpractice that destroys everything you've built over 43 years. Harold nodded, understanding the magnitude of what he was contemplating. "Max's case taught me that doing the right thing sometimes requires risking everything else. These families trusted me with the most important decisions about their pets' lives, and if I failed them, they deserve to know the truth." The irony of the situation was not lost on Harold. His decision to save Max's life by questioning established medical opinion had led directly to the discovery that his own practices might have been inadequate in previous cases. The moment of professional triumph was revealing itself as the beginning of a much larger reckoning with the limitations and failures that had marked his career without his recognition. Over the following week, Harold methodically reviewed 5 years of case files with the thoroughness of a detective investigating his own professional conduct. He had requested additional records from specialists, laboratory reports, and follow-up notes, creating a comprehensive picture of his diagnostic practices that revealed patterns he had never recognized before. The review process was emotionally devastating. Harold discovered that he had developed an unconscious reliance on specialists, opinions that had gradually replaced his own diagnostic investigation skills. Where he once would have conducted thorough independent examinations, he had increasingly accepted referral conclusions without adequate verification or consideration of alternative possibilities. Martha worked beside him through these difficult days, helping organize files and contact previous patients' families when necessary. Her loyalty remained unwavering, but Harold could see the strain in her eyes as they uncovered case after case where more thorough investigation might have led to different outcomes. "Doc, you need to understand that you were following accepted practices," Martha said as they reviewed another file involving a pet that had been euthanized for suspected neurological deterioration. "Every veterinarian in the region relies on specialist consultations for complex cases." Harold shook his head, his professional ethics diary open beside him as he documented each concern and moral struggle the investigation was revealing. "But that doesn't make it right, Martha. These families trusted me to be their advocate, not just a conduit for other people's opinions. The diary had become Harold's way of processing the ethical implications of what he was discovering. Each entry explored his responsibility to his patients, his obligation to their families, and his duty to the profession that had given his life meaning for 4 decades. The most painful discovery came when Harold realized that 3 additional cases beyond Bella, Sam, and Luna might have involved similar diagnostic shortcuts. In each instance, he had accepted specialist recommendations for euthanasia without conducting the kind of independent investigation that had saved Max's life. The legal consultation Harold arranged with his professional liability insurance company provided sobering insight into the potential scope of his exposure. The attorney, a specialist in veterinary malpractice cases, explained that multiple claims involving similar diagnostic issues could establish a pattern of negligent practice that would be difficult to defend. Dr. Baines, the challenge you're facing is that your decision to save Max demonstrates that you had the knowledge and skills to recognize vestibular syndrome when you chose to apply them thoroughly, the attorney explained. That makes it difficult to argue that similar failures in previous cases were simply honest mistakes rather than negligent shortcuts. Harold understood the legal logic, even as it felt like punishment for doing the right thing with Max. So, saving one dog's life might cost me my license and my practice because it proves I should have been more thorough with the others? That's one possible interpretation that opposing counsel will certainly argue. However, it's also possible to frame your actions with Max as evidence of professional growth and commitment to excellence that should be viewed favorably. The community response to news of the malpractice lawsuit was swift and divided. Some families who had received Harold's care for decades rallied to his support, writing letters to the local newspaper defending his character and professional competence. Others began questioning decisions he had made for their own pets, wondering if they too had been victims of inadequate diagnostic practices. The Morrison family proved to be among Harold's most vocal supporters, despite the fact that their experience had inadvertently triggered the broader investigation. Tom Morrison visited the clinic to express his continued confidence in Harold's abilities and to offer whatever assistance might be helpful during the legal proceedings. Dr. Baines, Max is completely recovered now, Tom said, sitting in Harold's office while the golden retriever waited in the examination room. He's running, playing, and acting like his old self again. If you hadn't had the courage to question that diagnosis, we would have lost him unnecessarily. Harold appreciated the support, but he couldn't escape the logical conclusion that if he could save Max by questioning a specialist diagnosis, he should have been doing the same kind of thorough investigation for every patient throughout his career. The State Veterinary Board initiated their own investigation after receiving complaints from families of the potentially misdiagnosed pets. Harold voluntarily cooperated with their inquiry, providing complete records and submitting to extensive interviews about his diagnostic practices and professional standards. The board investigation was particularly concerning because it had the authority to suspend or revoke Harold's veterinary license regardless of the outcome of civil malpractice claims. Professional sanctions could end his career, even if he successfully defended against financial damages in court. Harold made the difficult decision to contact the board proactively, requesting a formal hearing where he could present his own analysis of the cases in question and propose reforms to prevent similar problems in the future. This approach carried significant risk, as it essentially constituted a voluntary admission that his practices had been inadequate. But Harold believed that taking responsibility was more important than protecting himself. I want to propose mandatory continuing education requirements for all veterinarians regarding rare conditions that can mimic more common diagnoses, Harold told the board investigator during their preliminary interview. I also think we need protocols for independent diagnostic review before any euthanasia recommendation, especially in cases involving young animals or unclear symptom presentations. The investigator seemed surprised by Harold's proactive approach to addressing the problems his case had revealed. Most veterinarians in your situation would be focused on defending their previous actions, rather than proposing systemic changes to prevent future occurrences. Harold had given considerable thought to his motivations and priorities as the investigation proceeded. "I'm 67 years old and facing retirement regardless of what happens with these proceedings. My legacy shouldn't be about protecting my reputation. It should be about ensuring that other veterinarians learn from my mistakes and other families don't experience unnecessary losses." Media attention began focusing on Harold's case as word spread about the miracle dog whose last-minute salvation had revealed potential problems with veterinary diagnostic practices. Local television stations requested interviews, and veterinary professional organizations began discussing the broader implications of Harold's experience for the field as a whole. Harold declined most media requests, but he did agree to speak with the Regional Veterinary Association's newsletter about the importance of diagnostic humility and the dangers of over-relying on specialist opinions without independent verification. Every veterinarian needs to maintain their own diagnostic skills and clinical judgment, even when consulting with specialists, Harold wrote in the article that would later be reprinted in veterinary journals nationwide. Specialization and advanced technology are valuable tools, but they should supplement rather than replace the fundamental examination and reasoning skills that form the foundation of good medical practice. The article generated significant discussion within the veterinary community, with some practitioners defending current referral practices while others acknowledged that Harold's experience highlighted important concerns about maintaining clinical skills and independent judgment. As the formal board hearing approached, Harold spent his evenings preparing testimony that would effectively amount to a comprehensive confession of professional inadequacy, balanced against a proposal for systemic reforms that could prevent similar problems for other practitioners. Martha helped him organize evidence and documentation, but she continued to express concern about Harold's willingness to accept full responsibility for practices that were common throughout the profession. "Doc, you're going to destroy your own career to make a point about diagnostic standards that most veterinarians don't even recognize as a problem," she said as they prepared materials for the hearing. Harold looked at the photograph of Max and Lily that the Morrison family had brought to the clinic, showing the completely recovered dog playing fetch in their backyard. "Martha, if destroying my career prevents other families from losing their pets unnecessarily, then it's worth the personal cost." The hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Harold understood that it would likely determine not only his professional future, but also establish peace. The State Veterinary Board hearing convened at 9 o'clock on a crisp October morning in the conference room of the State Capitol building. Harold arrived 30 minutes early, carrying a briefcase containing 43 years of professional documentation and wearing his best suit, the same one he had worn to receive his veterinary degree decades earlier. The hearing room was more formal than Harold had anticipated, with a long table for the 5 board members, witness chairs, and seating for observers that was filling with people whose presence both surprised and moved him. Martha sat in the front row, along with Tom and Sarah Morrison. Behind them, Harold recognized Mrs. Henderson with her cat carrier, the Walsh family, and dozens of other clients who had driven from their rural community to show support. Dr. Patricia Winters, the board chairwoman and a distinguished veterinary surgeon from the State University, called the proceedings to order with professional dignity. "Dr. Baines, you have requested this voluntary hearing to address concerns regarding diagnostic practices in your clinic. Please understand that these proceedings will be recorded and may result in professional sanctions up to and including license revocation." Harold stood to acknowledge the gravity of what he was undertaking. "I understand completely. Dr. Winters, I requested this hearing because I believe the veterinary profession deserves A thorough examination of the diagnostic failures these cases have revealed. The board's attorney began by presenting the formal complaints that had been filed, detailing the cases of Bella, Sam, and Luna, 3 animals that had been euthanized for suspected neurological deterioration without adequate consideration of alternative diagnoses. The presentation was clinical and factual, but Harold felt the weight of each family's loss as if he were experiencing it for the first time. Dr. Baines, how do you respond to these allegations of inadequate diagnostic practices? Dr. Winters. Harold had prepared for this moment for weeks, but the reality of confessing professional failures in a formal setting was more difficult than he had anticipated. Dr. Winters, I accept full responsibility for failing to provide these families and their pets with the thorough diagnostic investigation they deserved. In each case, I relied too heavily on specialist recommendations without conducting adequate independent verification. The admission sent a visible ripple through the hearing room. Attorneys typically advise clients to deny wrongdoing or minimize responsibility. But Harold's direct acknowledgement of failure was unexpected in formal disciplinary proceedings. Dr. James Crawford, a board member and practicing veterinarian from the northern part of the state, leaned forward with interest. Dr. Baines, are you saying that standard consultation practices with specialists are inadequate? I'm saying that consultation should supplement rather than replace independent clinical judgment, Harold replied. In these cases, I accepted specialist opinions without conducting the kind of thorough examination that saved Max Morrison's life just 2 weeks ago. Harold spent the next hour presenting detailed analysis of each problematic case, explaining where his diagnostic process had fallen short and describing specific steps that could have led to different outcomes. His testimony was methodical, honest, and devastatingly self-critical. The board members asked probing questions about Harold's decision-making process, his consultation practices, and his understanding of professional standards. Harold answered each question with complete honesty, acknowledging limitations he had never previously recognized in his own practice. Dr. Baines, said Dr. Margaret Foster, a board member who specialized in veterinary ethics, your willingness to accept responsibility is commendable, but don't you think you're being overly harsh in your self-assessment? Many veterinarians follow similar consultation practices. Harold had anticipated this question and had given considerable thought to his response. Dr. Foster, the fact that substandard practices are common doesn't make them acceptable. These families trusted me to be their advocate, not merely a conduit for other veterinarians' opinions. The morning session concluded with Harold's presentation of his comprehensive proposal for diagnostic reform. He outlined mandatory continuing education requirements, protocols for independent review before euthanasia recommendations, and quality assurance procedures designed to prevent the kind of diagnostic shortcuts that had characterized his recent practice. I'm not asking this board to excuse my failures, Harold concluded. I'm asking you to use them as a catalyst for improvements. That will prevent other veterinarians from making similar mistakes and other families from experiencing unnecessary losses. During the lunch recess, Harold was approached by several of his clients who had attended the hearing. Mrs. Henderson took his hand with tears in her eyes, expressing gratitude for decades of compassionate care despite the current proceedings. Dr. Baines, you saved Patch's life 3 times over the years, she said quietly. Whatever mistakes you think you've made, please remember all the good you've done as well. Tom Morrison approached with similar sentiments. Doctor, Max is completely healthy because you had the courage to question an expert opinion. That shows exactly the kind of veterinarian you really are. Harold appreciated their support, but he remained focused on the afternoon session where families of the potentially misdiagnosed pets would have the opportunity to present their own testimony about the impact of his diagnostic failures. The afternoon session resumed with testimony from the families, whose pets had been affected by Harold's diagnostic shortcomings. The Hendricks family, who had filed the original malpractice lawsuit regarding Bella, spoke with quiet dignity about their loss and their belief that more thorough investigation might have saved their German shepherd. "We trusted Dr. Baines completely," Mrs. Hendricks testified, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. "Bella was only 3 years old, and we accepted his recommendation because we believed he had exhausted all possibilities. Learning that she might have been treatable is devastating." Harold listened to each family's testimony with the full attention their loss deserved, making notes about how his reforms could address the specific failures they described. The Peterson family spoke about Sam, the border collie whose symptoms had so closely matched Max's. The Rodriguez family described Luna's rapid decline and their trust in Harold's expertise. Each testimony reinforced Harold's conviction that significant changes were needed in veterinary diagnostic practices, but the emotional weight of hearing directly from families about their losses was almost overwhelming. Dr. Richardson appeared as a witness via video conference, providing testimony about the diagnostic challenges involved in distinguishing between progressive neurological conditions and treatable alternatives like vestibular syndrome. "The symptoms can be virtually identical in early stages," Dr. Richardson explained to the board. "Dr. Baines demonstrated exceptional clinical judgment in questioning my diagnosis of Max Morrison, his willingness to pursue independent testing when his examination suggested alternative possibilities represents the standard we should all aspire to maintain." Dr. Winters asked Richardson directly about Harold's proposed reforms. "In your opinion, would mandatory review protocols prevent similar diagnostic errors?" "Absolutely," Richardson replied without hesitation. "Independent verification should be standard practice before any euthanasia recommendation, especially in cases involving young animals or ambiguous symptom presentations." The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Lily Morrison, accompanied by her parents and Max, had been permitted to address the board despite her age. She approached the witness chair with the determination that had characterized her support for Harold throughout the proceedings. "Max is my best friend, and Dr. Baines saved his life by being brave enough to say that other doctors might be wrong," Lily said, her clear voice carrying throughout the hearing room. "If Dr. Baines hadn't asked more questions, Max would be dead right now, and that would have been the worst mistake ever." She turned to look directly at Harold before continuing. "Dr. Baines told me that good doctors never stop learning and never stop asking questions. Maybe he made mistakes before, but he learned from them, and now Max gets to live because Dr. Baines was willing to be wrong about being right." Her simple, direct testimony captured the essence of what Harold had been trying to communicate about the importance of diagnostic humility and continuous learning. The hearing room was silent as board members absorbed the profound wisdom contained in a 10-year-old's perspective on professional growth and accountability. After all testimony concluded, the board recessed for deliberation. Harold waited in the hallway with Martha and the Morrison family, uncertain about what decision the board would reach but satisfied that he had presented his case with complete honesty and comprehensive proposals for reform. Dr. Winters called the hearing back to order after 2 hours of deliberation. "Dr. Baines, this board has reviewed your testimony, your proposed reforms, and the evidence regarding your diagnostic practices. We have reached a unanimous decision." Harold stood to receive the board's judgment, prepared for sanctions that could end his career, but hopeful that his proposals for reform would be adopted regardless of personal consequences. "This board finds that your diagnostic practices in the cases under review fell below acceptable professional standards," Dr. Winters began. "However, we also find that your voluntary disclosure, comprehensive analysis, and proactive reform proposals demonstrate extraordinary professional integrity." The chairwoman continued with the formal decision. "Dr. Baines, you will receive a professional censure that will remain on your record permanently. However, your license will remain active under the condition that you implement the diagnostic, review protocols you have proposed, and provide training to other veterinarians in the region regarding diagnostic humility and independent verification practices. Harold felt relief wash over him, not for the preservation of his license, but for the board's acceptance of his reform proposals. Dr. Winters, I accept these conditions gladly. May I also establish a fund to assist families who have been affected by similar diagnostic errors? That would be commendable, Dr. Baines. This board also directs you to work with our continuing education committee to develop mandatory training programs based on your recommendations. As the hearing concluded, Harold was surrounded by clients and colleagues offering congratulations and support. The Morrison family embraced him warmly, with Max providing enthusiastic kisses that reminded everyone why the entire proceeding had been worthwhile. Harold's veterinary license remained intact, but more importantly, his experience would now serve as the foundation for systematic improvements in veterinary diagnostic practices that could prevent future families from experiencing unnecessary losses. 6 months later, Harold stood in his transformed clinic, watching as veterinarians from across the region gathered for the monthly diagnostic review seminar that had become a cornerstone of his new mission. The waiting room that had once displayed only photographs of successful treatments now included a memorial wall honoring pets like Bella, Sam, and Luna, animals whose losses had catalyzed important changes in veterinary medicine. Max bounded through the clinic doors with his characteristic enthusiasm, completely recovered and serving as a living testament to the power of diagnostic persistence. Lily followed close behind, now 11 and more confident, carrying a folder of her own drawings that depicted Max's recovery journey. Dr. Baines, I brought you something, Lily announced, pulling out a carefully colored picture that showed Harold kneeling beside Max during that crucial examination 6 months earlier. It's called The Doctor Who Listens to Dogs. Harold accepted the drawing with gratitude that had only deepened over the months since Max's rescue. The image captured something essential about what he had learned, that healing required not just medical knowledge, but the wisdom to remain curious and humble in the face of uncertainty. The Second Chances Veterinary Foundation, established with funding from Harold's own retirement savings and contributions from grateful families, had become a model for diagnostic accountability in veterinary practice. The foundation provided grants for continuing education, funded research into diagnostic challenges, and offered support to families affected by medical errors. Martha now served as the foundation's executive coordinator while continuing her duties at the clinic. The combination of roles suited her perfectly, allowing her to help implement the reforms she had witnessed Harold develop through his professional crisis. Doc, we have 12 veterinarians signed up for today's seminar, Martha reported, reviewing the attendance list, including 2 specialists from the university who want to understand how to better collaborate with general practitioners. The seminars had evolved into comprehensive training programs that emphasize diagnostic humility, independent verification procedures, and the importance of questioning established conclusions when examination findings suggested alternative possibilities. Harold's curriculum had been adopted by veterinary schools throughout the region and was being considered for national implementation. Dr. Richardson attended many of the seminars, speaking about the collaborative relationship between specialists and general practitioners that Harold's experience had helped define. Specialization should enhance rather than replace fundamental clinical skills, Richardson told each group of participants. Dr. Baines demonstrated that the most sophisticated testing is only as good as the questions we ask and the observations we make. The memorial wall in Harold's clinic had become a powerful teaching tool. reminding visitors that medical practice carried profound responsibilities to both patients and their families. Each memorial included information about the diagnostic challenges the case had presented and the lessons learned from reviewing the outcome. Harold's professional practice had been fundamentally transformed by his experience with Max. Every case now involved comprehensive independent examination, consultation with multiple specialists when appropriate, and thorough documentation of diagnostic reasoning. The additional time required for this approach had reduced his patient volume, but it had dramatically improved the quality of care he provided. The malpractice lawsuit filed by the Hendricks family had been settled through the Foundation's compensation program, which Harold had designed to provide both financial support and comprehensive explanation of what had occurred. The family had become advocates for the diagnostic reforms Harold promoted, speaking at veterinary conferences about the importance of thoroughness and accountability. Helen often joined Harold at the clinic during Foundation events, having discovered her own sense of purpose in supporting the educational mission that had emerged from his professional crisis. Harold has found a way to transform his worst professional moment into his most meaningful contribution to veterinary medicine, she told visitors who inquired about their experience. The State Veterinary Board had made Harold's diagnostic protocols mandatory for all practitioners in the region, creating standardized procedures for independent verification before euthanasia recommendations. The success of these protocols had attracted attention from veterinary organizations nationwide, with several states considering similar requirements. As the afternoon seminar concluded, Harold found himself reflecting on the journey that had led from Max's near euthanasia to his current role as an advocate for diagnostic reform. The transformation had been painful, but ultimately more fulfilling than he could have imagined when he was struggling to write his retirement letter months earlier. Tom Morrison stopped by the clinic with Max for their monthly checkup, which had become as much a social visit as a medical appointment. Max's recovery had been complete and permanent, with no lingering effects from his vestibular syndrome episode. Dr. Baines, we wanted to thank you again for having the courage to question that diagnosis, Tom said as Harold completed Max's examination. Max is living a completely normal life because you were willing to admit uncertainty when other people were expressing absolute confidence. Harold scratched Max behind the ears, remembering the moment when the dog's gentle hug had prompted him to look more carefully at subtle signs he might otherwise have missed. Max taught me as much as I helped him, Tom. Sometimes our patients are our best teachers if we're humble enough to listen to what they're trying to tell us. As evening settled over the clinic, Harold sat at his desk writing notes for the next month's continuing education program. The retirement letter he had struggled to compose months earlier remained unfinished in his desk drawer, no longer relevant to his future plans. At 67, Harold had discovered that the most meaningful chapter of his career was just beginning. The Second Chances Foundation had given him a platform to influence veterinary practice far beyond his own clinic, ensuring that the lessons learned from Max's case would prevent other families from experiencing unnecessary losses. The legacy Harold was building through diagnostic reform and continuing education would outlast any individual career and protect countless animals whose lives might otherwise be lost to inadequate investigation. Max's near-death experience had become the catalyst for systematic changes that would benefit veterinary patients for generations to come. Harold locked the clinic doors and headed home to Helen, carrying with him the satisfaction that comes from transforming personal failure into lasting positive change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to advance the cause of diagnostic excellence. But tonight he could rest in the knowledge that Max's story had helped create a better future for veterinary medicine.